my task is to tell about the life of Emil Molt and the founding of the first Waldorf school. This is quite an honor because I'm a great fan of Emil Molt. His incarnation was a very special incarnation. And I wanted to start with his favorite verse that his granddaughter found in his diaries. Live in the love of the deed. Live in the understanding of the deeds of the other. This is the law of the free human being. This verse is a lot like Emil Molt. And to the point. Pedro, I wonder if you would put up the first picture, which is the cover of the book, Emil and Berta. See this book because much of what I'm saying is recorded in this book. And my company, Waldorf Publications, was lucky enough to publish this book, written by the granddaughter of Emil and Berta Molt. Emil Molt is there in the lower right-hand corner, leaning on a cane. And Berta, you can see on the other side of the picture, there are three adults, three women on the very left-hand side. And Berta is the woman in the dark jacket, the highest one up of those three women. And they're with a class at the Waldorf school. We can't tell which one. But many people say, oh, Rudolf Steiner founded the first Waldorf school. This is not correct. Emil Molt and Berta Molt founded the first Waldorf school. And they were very good friends of Rudolf Steiner and went right to him with their idea. And Rudolf Steiner was overjoyed that they asked him, and he developed the curriculum. But Emil and Berta spent their whole life from that point on. They devoted their whole lives and their whole fortunes to support the Waldorf school. And Emil was an extraordinary man. Once on the playground of the Waldorf school, Emil Molt was walking with Rudolf Steiner, and the little children on the playground made fun of Emil Molt as they walked by. And this hurt Emil Molt's feelings. And he turned to Rudolf Steiner and said, why do they make fun of me like this? Rudolf Steiner said to Emil Molt, they were Saxons in a previous incarnation, and you as Charlemagne killed them. And another time, Rudolf Steiner confided in Laura, who was the niece of Emil Molt, who was the first eurythmist. And it is told that Rudolf Steiner confided in Laura that Emil Molt was in a previous life Charlemagne. And Charlemagne's mother and his daughter were both called Berta, and Emil Molt ended up marrying Berta. There are other linkages to Charlemagne and to Emil Molt. And there's a book by a Dutch Waldorf teacher called An Exploration into the Destiny of the Waldorf School Movement that is available in Spanish and on the online Waldorf library. And he talks a lot about the linkages between Charlemagne and Emil Molt. But extraordinary though this incarnation was, the life of Emil Molt was not an easy life. In the village of Württemberg, which is in the region southwest in Germany, called Schwabia. And they have their own, it's a little bit like it's a little bit like the Basque. It has its own language and its own culture. And at the time Emil Molt was born to this baker and his wife in 1876, Schwabia had its own king. Now, when Emil Molt was born, he was a very sickly child. His mother had him baptized minutes after he was born by the local priest because she was afraid he wouldn't live at all. And his father, the baker, was very angry that he had a weak and pathetic son because he wanted a strong, robust son. And the father was prone, he had heart disease, his father, and was prone to outbursts of furious anger. So his mother compensated by spoiling him. And a doctor in the village told her she should feed him wine as a medicine to make him strong. And she spoiled him with sweet cakes from the bakery. And this did not make the child strong. And the life that they lived was very hard. The father worked all day, every day, even Sunday, for after church cakes for the wealthy people of Württemberg. And his father died at the age of 43 years old when little Emil was only 7 years old. And his mother then moved to her brother's village of Altdorf, not too far away, because she couldn't do the bakery by herself. And her brother was a very strict Protestant Christian. And little Emil went from his life of sweet cakes and wine to a very strict schedule, a lot of slapping on the wrist for not studying hard enough. And his mother, who worried about him all the time, worried that her brother was too strict. And so she saved up her money and moved them to Stuttgart to live with her sister. So for 3 or 4 years, they lived in Stuttgart with the sister. And little Emil was a wild child. No one could control him. He got spanked a lot and punished a lot, put in dark closets because he was a bad boy. But then his mother grew very ill. And Emil felt responsible as a child because he was a bad boy, that he made his mother sick. And he began to change, but he still had great trouble in school and was still punished a great deal. He didn't like mathematics at all. This infuriated his teachers. And when Emil was 13 and a half years old, his mother died. And nobody knew what to do with Emil Hugo. His uncle in Altdorf didn't want him back. His aunt didn't want to be responsible for him. None of the schools in Stuttgart wanted to take responsibility for him. So a place was found for him in the village of Kalv. And this was like a boarding school for young boys. He lived in a boarding house with 6 other boys and went to school at what we would now call a progressive school nearby the boarding house. And at this school, they did not believe in corporal punishment. And he was amazed because his friends were very dedicated students because they wanted to be, not because people were correcting them and making them be good students. They chose to learn. And the teachers trusted them to be motivated to learn on their own. And in a year, Emil Hugo had become a new young man, and everyone who knew him was amazed at how studious and what a good fellow he had become. And at age 14, his school ended, and the school helped him to find an apprenticeship. And this apprenticeship was in Stuttgart with a family, with a man named Georgie. He and his wife ran what we would now call a department store or a general store. They sold everything from farm equipment and grain to knitting needles and fabric. It was a very popular store in Stuttgart and very successful. And Emil was one of 3 apprentices. The apprenticeship was for 3 years, and Emil had to pay $600 to have this apprenticeship. He received no pay for his work as an apprentice, and he lived in the apartments above the department store with Mr. and Mrs. Georgie. And in his 3 years, he worked all day, every day, from 7 o'clock in the morning until dinner time at night. And Emil Molt often worked after dinner as well. And on Sunday, they all went to church in the morning. And Emil had to learn French and English as other languages after church. And in the work, Emil learned how interesting the whole business world was. And one of the things he had to learn as part of the business was the bookkeeping part of the business. And Emil, who hated math so much in school, loved bookkeeping. And the reason he loved it is that he realized behind every transaction recorded in the bookkeeping, there was a human being who made the transaction. And this made him very excited. He taught himself stenography so that he could take notes more quickly. And later on, he taught his future wife, Berta, how to do stenography so that they could exchange tendernesses and love statements without anybody knowing. So after he finished his apprenticeship, Mr. Georgie, who loved Emil and was very impressed at how well he had done, offered him a position with a salary. And Emil was very excited to have a job. And now he had Sundays off and he could go do what he wanted on Sunday, and he had money to do things when he had free time. And one time on a Sunday at a festival, he met 3 beautiful young women from the same family. And one of them was Berta. Now, her older sister, Emma, was very enthusiastic and energetic. And Berta was very, very shy and withdrawing. And then there was a littler sister, Paula, who was still a little girl. But they were known well in Stuttgart because they were such charming young ladies and so beautiful. Here's an interesting side note about Berta. When Berta was 7, she had a bad reaction to a tuberculosis vaccine. And every winter after that, for 5 or 6 years, she had to be in an oxygen tank for all the winter months, or she couldn't breathe. These illnesses increased her natural shyness. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that when Emil was in the boarding school, there were 2 friends he made with all the boys who were his friends that he kept as friends for his whole life. And one of those was the author Hermann Hesse. When I was young, everybody read Hermann Hesse's books. Yeah. And both of those friends were also interested in Berta. But when they saw what happened when Berta and Emil were together, they backed away. It was bigger than they were. But at that time, the social structures were very strict, and Emil and Berta never had any chance to get together again after that festival. And Berta began to pine away. She grew pale, she didn't eat well, and her mother was really worried about her. And her older sister, Emma, was able to find out that it was because she was lovesick for Emil. So she began arranging things to invite Emil over to the house and have him be part of the family. And in Berta's diary, the first time Emil came to the house and she shook hands with Emil, he felt an electric shock go through her whole body. And she withdrew and hid and cried and cried. So this was a relationship that really was meant to be. Now, after a while, Mr. Georgii became more and more interested in the rising cigarette industry. And Mr. Georgii sent Emil to Greece to talk to the tobacco growers there. And this was such a big change for Emil, who had never left the region of Swabia. And he was amazed when he got to Greece how different the life there was. And he loved the flamboyant way the Greeks dressed. He loved the dancing and the singing. And he loved everything about the tobacco industry. And the Greeks loved Emil. And he signed a contract with them to work there for 4 years. And he dreamed of marrying Berta and moving her to Petras in Greece. But it wasn't meant to be because Emil Georgii, the older brother of the Georgii family, wanted to hire him as the sales manager for his new business called the United Cigarette Works. And Emil found a replacement for himself with the Greeks before he broke the contract and went back to Stuttgart, which he was glad to do because he would get a very good salary and then he could marry his true love, Berta. By now, Emil could speak German, Greek, French, English, and Italian. And he threw himself into learning everything he could about the tobacco industry. And he kept his good friends in Greece as reliable business people who grew the highest quality tobacco. And he investigated so thoroughly all the different kinds of tobacco that there were, that more than once he gave himself nicotine poisoning and fainted. So he had to learn how to balance things in his work. Now, it's a long, complicated story, but Emil Georgii was kind of a spoiled oldest son in the Georgii family. And he was more interested in inventions, machines that made cigarettes and things like that than he was in the real business of the tobacco industry. And when Emil recognized this, he worried about the business not being sustainable the way Emil Georgii was running it. and Mr. Georgi spent more and more time away from the business, leaving the management of it to Emil. And Emil Molt and a friend of his, Max Mark, made an amazing business deal with another tobacco business in Hamburg. And they founded together the Waldorf Astoria Cigarette Company. And Emil insisted that he be an equal partner. But Max Mark and the people in Hamburg said, you don't have enough money. And Emil said, I will invest at the same level as both of you. And he explained to his wife, now his wife, he finally married Berta, that he felt his angel was speaking through him when he made this rash commitment to 20,000 marks he didn't have. And Berta went to work right away and found the 20,000 marks from her family for Emil. And this was the first time that this lifelong partnership that Berta and Emil had was made manifest. Now, around the same time that Emil made this remarkable deal and Berta made this remarkable rescue of the deal, and Emil became interested around that same time in a popular subject that at that time was called mind control. And both of them were not very religious people. They weren't enamored of the rituals at church and the costumes at church, but they both believed deeply in a higher reality, in their own higher selves, and in things like angels speaking to you in business meetings. So when Emil saw that there was a lecture at a place called the Theosophical Society about mind control, he went to listen. And Berta went with him, and they met a business associate of Emil Molt's there. And Emil Molt told the friend that he was very impressed with the lecture. And that man said, wow, if you like that guy, you should go hear Rudolf Steiner. And the next time Rudolf Steiner came to speak in Stuttgart, this friend bought them tickets to go hear him speak. And at that lecture, Emil Molt met other people who are interested in Steiner, and they were invited over to their home for a study group. So Pedro, you should show the picture, the next picture, which is Rudolf Steiner and Emil Molt. Gracias, Pedro. So here you see these two men who were to become fast friends. And from that point on, Emil Molt would go to Rudolf Steiner's lectures and then think, how can I apply what Rudolf Steiner is saying in my cigarette factory? And he therefore, with these ideas, did very remarkable things in his cigarette factory. He got rid of all Mr. Georgi's machines and had people assemble the cigarettes by hand. He got to know his workers and applied great personal interest in each of the individuals employed in his company. And he used profits from the company to invest in many of the ideas that Rudolf Steiner was working to accomplish. Eventually, Rudolf Steiner became a regular visitor to Emil and Berta Molt's home. And Emil Molt never lost his deep reverence for who the personality of Rudolf Steiner was. Now, many of you have heard about the first Goetheanum that Rudolf Steiner built, this magnificent artistic work. So Pedro, I wonder if you could take this picture down and put up the picture of the first Goetheanum. Now, this is a picture of the substructure of the building of the first Goetheanum. Interestingly, Steiner's first idea was to build it in concrete, but his group convinced him that it would be more artistic to more or less carve the first Goetheanum out of wood. And what started happening right away is that artists and workmen from all around the world came to spend time working on the first Goetheanum. Now, Emil Molt had experience with war in the world. He had served a year, a mandatory year in the German army. And his favorite thing about that was the uniform. He thought he looked very good in his uniform. And also when he was in Greece, right after he left Greece, Turkey and Greece ended up in a war. And he felt very lucky that he got out when he did, because the whole manufacturing collaboration between the two countries collapsed and much was destroyed in that war. And so when the threats of the First World War began looming in Germany, Emil Molt worried a great deal about this. But you know that the first Goetheanum ended up being built in Dornach, Switzerland, which is relatively close to the southwest of Germany and Stuttgart, maybe a 45, 50-minute drive. And when the First World War did break out, many of the workers in the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory, the young men were drafted into the army to fight that war. And Emil Molt promised every one of those young men that when the war was over, they would still have a job at the Stuttgart cigarette factory, which was a promise he ended up keeping with the help of his workers. They did job sharing and altered their schedules and did different shifts so that everyone could have a job and an income. And all during the war, the work on the first Goetheanum continued, and people from all over the world continued to come to help build the first Goetheanum. So while countries were fighting countries, people from all those countries were working side by side artistically on the first Goetheanum. When Emil Molt heard about the horrible, dreadful trench warfare that was happening in France, where for hours and hours and sometimes days, they sat in trenches with nothing to do before the next battle broke out and their life was on the line. So he sent 3 cigarettes to the front so that the men would have the relaxation of cigarettes. He talked to a friend who was a printer and had the printer print on very thin cigarette paper little stories to insert into the packages of cigarettes so that the men would have something to read that was uplifting while they whiled those long hours in the trenches. And eventually he went to Rudolf Steiner and asked Steiner to give him verses that he could print on the cigarette paper and get to the men in the front so that they would have courage and so that their hope would not fail. Now, when the First World War ended, Germany was badly punished, and the unfair Treaty of Versailles made the whole World War Germany's fault. In addition to the ruination and bombing of Germany, the German people were brokenhearted and humiliated. And the whole country was starving and their economy was in shambles. During this time, Emil Molt instituted lecture cycles at lunchtime in his factory. Anybody in his workforce who knew something, somebody who'd studied engineering in school, a woman who was a good quilter, they would get up and explain to their fellow workers at lunchtime their expertise. And at the end of the war, he bought 3 mountain homes, vacation homes in the mountains, and put a cook and a milk cow at every home. And he encouraged his workers to take their families up to those mountain homes on weekends and during vacations to eat well and relax and think nothing about work or the war. And he went to the army, who no longer needed their fleets of Mercedes-Benz for their top brass army people. And he bought the cars from the army and hired drivers. So anybody who needed a ride from Dornach to Stuttgart had a ride from Emil Molt's drivers and cars. Rudolf Steiner used these cars many times. And during this time, Emil Molt tried with all his energy to hire as many people who were anthroposophists into the workforce of the cigarette factory as he could. And he hired a man also named Emil Linehouse, to be his accountant. He asked Rudolf Steiner for a recommendation, and Rudolf Steiner gave a kind of lukewarm recommendation, but in his enthusiasm, Emil Molt went ahead and hired him. And this guy Linehouse began immediately talking about Emil Molt behind his back in a very destructive way. He's a businessman, he knows nothing of the spirit, he's so bourgeois, and created many, many difficulties for Emil Molt. Emil Molt at this time recognized that many of his workers were blocked from realizing their mission in life because they could not afford the education they needed to realize their ambitions. And he and Berta thought together that they could start a school for the children of the workers in their factory, so the same thing would not happen to them, to their parents. And Emil Molt held on to the idea, waiting for the right moment to speak to Rudolf Steiner about this. Meanwhile, in Germany, in the starvation and the chaos that followed the war, Steiner was trying very hard to get his ideas about a three-folded social organization into Germany. He wrote his appeal to the civilized world and got 100 important people to sign this appeal to look to threefolding as the way to repair Germany. But unfortunately, many things were happening and his anthroposophists were fighting amongst themselves. Linehouse was bad-mouthing Emil Molt, and Rudolf Steiner shut the whole thing down when he realized that the opportune moment had passed. And right around that time, Emil Molt asked Rudolf Steiner what he thought about the idea of starting a school for the children of his factory workers. And Rudolf Steiner was very excited about the idea. He recognized that a lot of his problem with telling people about the threefold social organization was that people's thinking was too rigid to really understand what he meant. So he looked to build a curriculum with gifted teachers who would create young human beings with the flexibility of thought possible to understand the threefold social organization. And Emil Molt told Rudolf Steiner that he had put aside 100,000 German marks to start the school. And this was an enormous amount of money. And Rudolf Steiner said, "Good, that should make a good start." And after Rudolf Steiner left, Emil said to Berta, "Did you hear what he said? That 100,000 marks will make a good start?" And Berta said, "Could be that Rudolf Steiner sees something bigger than we can see, Emil." So Pedro, would you put up the next picture, which is the picture of Emil and Berta around this time? So the work began immediately to start the school. This conversation with Rudolf Steiner happened in April of 1920, and the school opened in September of the same year. None of the people Steiner asked to teach in the school had been teachers before. And 12 brave people listened to Rudolf Steiner speak for 2 weeks in the lectures that we now call the Foundations of Human Experience, or the Study of Man. And we are living now the results of that first gesture of founding the first Waldorf school. And from the very beginning, money was a problem. And Emil Molt never, ever took his focus off the school. He emptied his pockets in support of the school. And in the conferences with teachers, every time Emil Molt could come to a teachers' meeting, Rudolf Steiner would start by saying, "We owe everything to Emil Molt. We are so lucky he's able to come to a meeting today." But this man, Linehouse, never stopped talking badly about Emil Molt. And he poisoned the minds even of the teachers. One day, Emil Molt went to the Goetheanum to meet with Steiner, and he passed Karl Stockmeyer, the head teacher at the school, in the Great Hall. I assume he drove in one of Emil Molt's cars. They greeted each other cordially. Emil Molt went to meet Steiner, and Steiner handed him silently the memo that Karl Stockmeyer had just delivered. And the memo said, "We feel that Emil Molt has no place at our meetings. He's not a teacher. He doesn't really know about the spiritual realities. He should not be allowed to be at our teachers' meetings." And Emil Molt made 2 mistakes. He didn't stay to talk to Steiner. He rushed back to Stuttgart. Second mistake, he stormed into the teachers' meeting and screamed his upset to the teachers in the meeting. And when he went home, Berta said, "Maybe that wasn't the best way to handle that situation, Emil." Emil Molt went back to the teachers' meeting. He apologized and said he would never come to a meeting again. He didn't want to be where he wasn't wanted. But he never stopped supporting the school. an organization called the Coming Day, Der Kommender Tag. It was a collaborative of businesses designed to be like B Corps, to give money over to the support of anthroposophical endeavors. Linehaus was head of Der Kommender Tag, and he badmouthed Emil Molt, saying, why doesn't Emil Molt put the cigarette factory into Der Kommender Tag? But Emil Molt was worried. He was a good businessman, and he saw that Der Kommender Tag, as well as the economy of Germany, were both a wreck. But he didn't want, and he only owned 47% of the cigarette factory. The Georgii family still owned the majority shares. Well, one day, inspired, he made the trip to the Georgii family and told them they should join the Der Kommender Tag, and they said yes. And he gathered up all his business associates to join Der Kommender Tag. And Emil Molt walked into a meeting of Der Kommender Tag, and Linehaus stood up and said, look, here is Emil Molt who has betrayed every principle of Der Kommender Tag. He's gone behind our backs and talked to them without us and comes in as if he's going to be the big hero, and he's ruined everything. And it broke Emil's heart that Steiner sat and listened and said nothing. And his broken heart repeated itself when he saw that Steiner signed off on the minutes of that meeting. And the organization, Der Kommender Tag, made the mistake of thinking that businesses existed in order to support the spiritual cultural sphere. It didn't value that businesses have a very strong purpose for meeting human needs. As soon as the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory was in Der Kommender Tag, Linehaus manipulated the organizational structure so that he became Emil Molt's boss. And 6 months later, he sold the cigarette factory as not profitable enough to really help the association. So Emil lost everything, but he never, ever stopped supporting the school. And he never, never complained about Linehaus. So Pedro, would you take this picture down and put up the family picture? Gracias. Emil and Berta had a son, Walter, who is the father of the woman who wrote this book. And here's Walter with his wife, Dora, and Emil and Berta. And Pedro, take that picture down and put up the picture of the first teachers. Actually, 2 pictures of the first teachers. Mm-hmm. This is a picture of the teachers after the first 2 years. These brave people who did something that was so brand new, the earth had never seen it before. And it started what we are now continuing 100 years later. And in conclusion, I'm sorry I went over. I would just ask us to consider the things that we continue doing that in this story were not so helpful. Talking behind each other's backs in destructive ways, of looking at businesses and business people as inferior and only there to give us money, allowing our natural envy of each other to become insidiously strong because we don't admit that we, as human beings, feel envious from time to time of each other. And I would also ask us to remember Emil Molt and imitate him. He understood the importance of this schooling, this curriculum, for the whole future of mankind, and he never gave up. Gracias. So, Lino, let's say the verse again. I'll say a line, you say a line, Lino. Live in the love of the deed. Live in the understanding of the other's deed. This is the law of the free human being. So thanks to everyone for your patient listening and my 10 minutes over time. I apologize.
Mira, ahorita 10 minutos para preguntas. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta que hacer a alguna de las 3 maestras. ¿Tienen alguna pregunta?
Sí, yo tengo un comentario, pregunta tipo. Me llama mucho la atención que desde el principio, y al mismo Steiner y a Molt, les pasa, decía que tenían problemas económicos en la escuela desde el principio, Y bueno, toda esta secuela final que nos platicaba Patrice, de la política y todas estas cuestiones, ¿no? Pues esta es la parte humana de la organización, ¿no? Por eso el comentario que hacía ayer Valkyria en el sentido del proceso, ¿no? Del proceso de la escuela. Me parece que no se nos debe olvidar eso, ¿no? Que somos seres humanos y que tenemos que tener una paciencia verdaderamente, lo voy a poner así, no sé si sea correcto, ¿no? Seguramente no, pero una paciencia espiritual, o sea, necesitamos conectarnos con una parte de nosotros a la que normalmente no tenemos acceso para poder aguantar etapas y periodos como este. Pero si nos vamos con la idea de que todo pasará, eso también pasará, la verdad es que es eso, ¿no? Que va a pasar también y que simplemente necesitamos aguantar, ser pacientes para enfrentar eso difícil, ¿no? Que todos enfrentamos en las organizaciones. Sería mi comentario. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Gracias, Carlos. Ahora está Radoni.
Hola, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias, Patrice. Thank you so much. Was a wonderful, wonderful lecture. Las tres ponentes me parecieron maravillosas. Nada más me queda una duda acerca de esta última conferencia y no sé si tal vez Patrice necesite traducción, pero yo quisiera saber si Rudolf Steiner comentó después en algún momento acerca de todas estas situaciones internas que dieron la separación, si dio alguna explicación con respecto al karma de, no sé, ¿fue esto un karma de la misma escuela Waldorf o fue un karma individual de Emil Molt o simplemente él ya no hizo ninguna aclaración al respecto o ningún comentario? Gracias. Esa sería mi pregunta.
So he, first to answer, Carlos is wondering, what can we do about this? We can do what Val just told us and what Becky just told us. We can strive. We can stay clear in our own hearts about what we're really thinking and feeling. We can live in the understanding of the deeds of the other. And we can love each other better. We can see the good in each other before we see the difficulties with each other. And to answer the other question, Rudolf Steiner never said anything. As the teacher of the anthroposophical circle, he followed an occult law that did not allow him to interfere in the karma of others. But he never dropped even a little bit in his deep friendship with Emil Molt. And he never stopped in his support spiritually and in the real world of Emil Molt. But he had a very special position, Rudolf Steiner, as an initiate and a teacher. But we can stand up for each other. We don't have that occult restriction. We can help each other and correct each other. I wish someone else in the room had said, hey, wait a minute, Linehouse, this is Emil Molt. Look at all he's done. Stop your bad-mouthing. No, nobody said anything. Often just like us. He gets in trouble, we step away and let them fall. In a movement that needs everybody we can get. There are my answers.
Thank you so much.
Radoni, nice to see you again after a long time.
A long, long time. Thank you, Patrice.
I'm glad you're still there.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Patrice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias, Patrice. Maravilloso, Patrice. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much. It was
Thank you, Patrice. It was really interesting.
Good.
Gracias, Patrice.
Gracias.
If it's going to be long, it better be interesting. So I hope it was.
Gracias, Patrice.
Hola, Elisana. Hola.
Hola, Patrice.
Hola.
Qué gusto saludarte. Nice to see you again.
We miss you.
I miss you.